Margaret Ann, do you want to get started?
Thanks, Khalil. Good evening. Welcome to the New Haven Museum. I'm Margaret Ann Takashewski, Executive Director, and we're delighted to have you with us tonight. Last week, the museum reopened its doors for the first time since November, and we are looking forward to welcoming everybody back in the coming months. A few bits of information. The museum is a partner in this year's NEA Big Read with the International Festival of Arts and Ideas, and the kickoff event held virtually is May 20th next week with US Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, author of An American Sunrise. And our historic Party Morris House will reopen for the summer on Sunday, June 6th, out in Morris Cove. So please check our website and social media channels for the latest information. May is Historic Preservation Month, and what better time to analyze the urban renewal of New Haven during the 1950s and 60s. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Elizabeth Cohen, is the author of the award-winning book, Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age, and she will deconstruct this complex topic for us. We're pleased to co-present tonight's program with the New Haven Preservation Trust. With us this evening is Elizabeth Holt, Director of Preservation Services.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Margaret Ann. I'm really happy to be here tonight. Thank you to the New Haven Museum and also to Connecticut Explored. I just wanted to let everyone know that we are celebrating Preservation Month all month on our social media channels, so we hope you're enjoying that. And we also have our awards and annual meeting coming up, which will be a virtual event on Thursday, June 17th, and this will be celebrating our 60th year. And the following week, Wednesday, June 23rd, we have a walking tour led by Bruce Cluett for the International Festival of Arts and Ideas, and you can find more information about those on our website.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Tonight's media sponsor is Connecticut Explored, the magazine of Connecticut history, and we thank them for their support, and we welcome magazine publisher Elizabeth Norman.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Norman, publisher of Connecticut Explored, the magazine of Connecticut history. We will be celebrating our 20th anniversary in 2022, so this is a great time to join us. We're really pleased to partner once again with New Haven Museum and with New Haven Preservation Trust on tonight's lecture. I'm really excited to hear Dr. Cohen tonight, having worked with her on her story in the hot off the press summer issue of Connecticut Explored. It's going in the mail to our subscribers in just a couple of days. I want to thank her and her publisher, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, for the opportunity to bring this important story to our readers. And I invite you to subscribe or to try us out with our first one free offer, which you can see there. You can find in our ctexplored.org/shop. And we've also just launched a bi-weekly e-newsletter. You can sign up for that at ctexplored.substack.com or via the pop-up that'll come up on ctexplored.org. Our summer issue is full of stories about the places we live and the places we love. I hope that you'll join us. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So tonight's speaker, Elizabeth Cohen, is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies and a University Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History at Harvard University. From 2011 to 18, she was the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Her books include Saving America's Cities, which recently won the 2020 Bancroft Prize in American History, Making a New Deal, Industrial Workers in Chicago, 1919 to 1939, also winner of the Bancroft Prize and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America. She's also co-author with David Kennedy and Margaret O'Mara of the popular U.S. history textbook, The American Pageant. Her writings have appeared in many edited volumes, academic journals, and popular venues, including The Atlantic, New York Times, The Washington Post, and The American Prospect. Dr. Cohen has been a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She was the Harold Vivian Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford and former president of the Urban History Association. Previously, she served in the history departments at Carnegie Mellon University and New York University. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and her AB from Princeton University. Welcome, Dr. Cohen.
Thank you very much. So let me share my screen. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me tonight. I wish we were gathered together in New Haven in person, but I think virtual is second best. We're getting used to it, and it may even have made it possible for more of you to attend tonight. Let me begin by giving you some background on why I wrote this book. And then I'll turn to the story of Ed Logue and his career in urban redevelopment. And I will discuss Logue's experiences, of course, in New Haven, but I'll also share with you what happened after he left the city for good in 1961, so that you can see his evolution over time and shifts in strategies of urban revitalization more broadly, since that is a very important theme in my book. I want to establish at the outset that I am not a biographer. I'm a social, political, and urban historian of the United States in the 20th century. And this is a very different kind of book than I have written before. In most of my earlier work as a social historian, I was writing the history of groups of ordinary Americans, whether first and second generation immigrants, factory workers, African Americans who had recently migrated from the South to the North and to the West, middle-class homeowners and consumers, and so forth. That kind of history is generally called history from the bottom up. So you might very well wonder why I've now written a biographically oriented book about a powerful white male city builder like Ed Logue. Well, I first decided that I wanted to write a book on post-World War II cities that grappled with the changing physical built environment, as well as how that change came about. As I put it in the book's introduction, I aim to understand who's in charge, who should have a say, who benefits, and who pays the bill. And I determined that focusing on the life of someone who was personally engaged with the struggle to revitalize post-war American cities in a period when mass suburbia was booming would be a promising way to frame the book, and I hoped to engage readers in this important story. I consequently became attracted to this new challenge as a writer of putting an individual with influence at the center of my book and writing, if you will, a history from the top down. But I wanted to bring to the analysis the social historian's concerns with the importance of social identities like class, gender, race and ethnicity, profession, and the like. In my previous book, Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America, I had written about the rise of mass suburbia as an increasingly important place of residence, work, and commerce after World War II, at least for middle-class white Americans. There I had explored what I call the landscape of mass consumption, the carving of new suburban housing developments out of farms and forests, and the rise of shopping centers at highway intersections. In that book, I implied that cities were being displaced by suburbia, but that was not my primary subject of investigation. So when I set out to write what eventually became Saving America's Cities, I wanted to understand better what the decentralization of American metropolitan areas had meant for cities, particularly for the older, established ones that had thrived with industrialization and immigration in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but were now, after World War II, in decline. I also felt from the start that we had a limited, fairly simplistic understanding of how post-war American cities had developed, based on essentially dismissing all efforts at urban redevelopment as disastrous urban renewal. That assumption seem to equate all interventions with the work of villains like New York's notorious Robert Moses. And in contrast, the ideal for post-war cities was thought to be best articulated by the more saintly Jane Jacobs, with her message of anti-planning, hands off, let neighborhoods and cities develop organically on their own, which often let market forces prevail. Surely, I thought, the story must be more complicated than a clash of these two extreme positions. Now, I certainly knew that urban renewal from the late 1940s into the 1970s had some very deep flaws, such as excessive demolition and dislocation of residents, who too often were African Americans and other minorities, a misguided belief that was inspired by the modernist urban designer Le Corbusier in the importance of separating residents from work and from retail, the imposition of suburban car-oriented schemes on downtowns, highways, slashing through neighborhoods, and more. But on the other hand, I also knew that many American cities were truly in trouble by the 1940s and in need of help. After a decade and a half of first a devastating Great Depression, followed by the deprivations of wartime, cities by the late 1940s and the 1950s were bleeding people, jobs, and much more to the booming suburbs. My final motivation in writing this book was that as a city dweller and a city lover, I was increasingly alarmed by what I was seeing around me. The shocking deterioration of urban infrastructure, particularly mass transit, as well as a worsening crisis in affordable housing almost everywhere in the United States, long before our recent pandemic, to the point where low rent apartments were fast disappearing, eviction and homelessness were growing, and more than a third of households were paying over 30% of their income on shelter. And in many places, large numbers of people were spending at least 50%. Moreover, a drastic divide has developed between cities that are flourishing and cities that are failing. So in effect, we have haves and have-nots among cities, not just within cities. So I wondered, how did we get here? And those underlying conditions have surely contributed greatly to the troubled way that American society has experienced the COVID crisis. I also wondered, where were the resources that once had made the United States a country with highly functional mass transit and well-engineered, up-to-date roads, bridges, and tunnels? And where was the commitment that had led the nation to at least assert in the Housing Act of 1949 a responsibility to provide, and I quote from the act, a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family, end quote. Might there not be something to learn from probing how we got to this place, I thought. So why Ed Logue? Well, I started looking around for an ideal subject for my book, and I had a little checklist. But most importantly, I was seeking an individual whose life would allow me to tell two intertwined stories, how both a person and a nation went about trying to revitalize American cities, and then the mutual influences, good and bad, that they had on each other and on American cities. It didn't take me long to stumble upon Ed Logue. From a course I had taught at Harvard on Boston's history, I already knew about his influence during the 1960s in turning around a long deteriorating Boston. Soon, however, I made a wonderful discovery that Logue had left an enormous cache of papers at his alma mater of Yale, that he had given many interviews over the years so that his own voice would come through to me, even though he was no longer alive, and that many of his associates from the cities where he had worked were still very much with us, in touch, were in touch with each other, and they had even launched a website called the Friends of Edward J. Logue. In time, I would figure out that the span of Logue's career offered me an amazing way of tracking shifts in urban redevelopment over more than 4 decades, as Logue worked in New Haven in the 1950s, in Boston in the 1960s, in New York State from the late 1960s to the mid 1970s, and in the South Bronx from 1978 to 1985. In the last 15 years of his life, Logue taught courses at MIT. He ran a small consulting business in urban redevelopment, and he tried unsuccessfully to write his memoirs. He left only one draft chapter, which I have. He was a doer, not a writer. Ed Logue died in 2000 on Martha's Vineyard at the age of not quite 79. So why is Ed Logue a compelling protagonist for this book? Well, first, Logue grew up caring deeply about cities. He was born in 1921 and raised in Philadelphia, one of 5 children, you see them all here, of a widowed kindergarten teacher without many financial resources. He went to Yale College on full scholarship and Yale Law School on the GI Bill, where he became deeply engaged in the city of New Haven, particularly with its working class residents, many of whom he knew from working in Yale's dining halls, and whom he later helped to organize into Yale's first labor union. When Logue married Margaret Devane, who was the daughter of the dean of Yale College at the time, his roots in New Haven grew even deeper. I paint a portrait of Logue as a complicated figure, loved and admired by some, deeply disliked by others, who from his earliest days was most comfortable being what I have termed a rebel in the belly of the establishment beast. And what I mean by that is that repeatedly over his lifetime, I saw Logue make his way into bastions of power and then fight hard to improve what he judged to be their damaging deficiencies. Second, Logue became committed to renewing cities as part of his liberal progressive politics, which runs quite counter to many assumptions that we make about who urban renewers actually were. They are often portrayed as part of a pro-business growth machine that put corporate investment over people. Logue stood in stark contrast to that stereotype. He worked as a labor organizer. You see him here with his union button, and he trained as a labor lawyer. He fought McCarthyism and discriminatory quotas at Yale. He argued strenuously that white, not Black America had a race problem to overcome. And he had no illusions that the private sector would do anything but prioritize profits over serving the public interest. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Logue thought that the problems of cities should be the next frontier of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and that extensive federal dollars and expert know-how should now be applied to the challenge of saving America's cities. A typical pronouncement of Logue's was, and I quote him, "The public sector created the new Boston, and the public sector must control it," end quote. Third, Logue came to believe early in his career that physical improvements in the built environment could have larger social and political benefits. And he discovered this in a surprising place. Logue served as special assistant to Chester Bowles, who was the American ambassador to the new nation of India in the early 1950s. And he was a former New Dealer himself, having headed Franklin Roosevelt's Office of Price Administration during World War II. He was also a Connecticut man. In India, Logue observed the US government and the Ford Foundation investing what was then called community development, improving the physical infrastructure of villages, roads, wells, housing, schools, and so forth, in hopes of creating a more equal, a more democratic, and it's important to remember this was the Cold War, anti-communist India. Logue subsequently brought lessons from what was then called the Third World back with him to his first world American cities. And I take note here, this is not the usual direction that we expect influence to run. Logue's time in the developing world was only the first example of how he learned from and participated in a transnational circulation of ideas about architecture and city planning. And this was very common after World War II. He He was also inspired by European social housing, and later in his career by the creation of European new towns, a strategy for creating new communities for people to live in and to work in nations that had been devastated by World War II. And fourth, upon return from India in the fall of 1953, Logue began a career in urban redevelopment that would unfold in 4 acts over 4 decades. As I follow Logue's personal story in the book, we see an urban renewal process that was not at all static, but rather one that continued to change over time, to experiment with different approaches in response to its own often admitted failures, as well as to shifts in national policy and national politics, and to implement some somewhat surprisingly progressive ideas. Urban renewal in this telling is not the one huge disaster of popular lore, but rather a much more complex evolutionary response to American cities in crisis. Now, I won't take you through all the details of a half century of this history. You'll have to read the book to get that. But here are some highlights of Logue's 4 acts in renewing cities. Act 1, New Haven, your hometown. From 1954 to 1961, Logue teamed up with a newly elected Reform Democratic mayor, Richard C. Lee, to try to turn around a city in big trouble. Failing older industries were closing, while many successful companies were abandoning their original home of New Haven, leading to the disappearance of good working class jobs. And this was happening just as African Americans were arriving from the South with great hopes of making a better living in the industrial North. At the same time, middle-class white residents were moving to the suburbs in search of newer housing, better schools, and other aspects of modern living, in some cases quite explicitly fleeing a city that they saw becoming more non-white. And finally, the new I-95 highway threatened to bypass downtown New Haven, which was a potential death knell to the city's role as the retail center of the region, and it was already facing competition from new suburban shopping centers that were opening around the city. Lee and Logue had some notable successes, but overall, their first phase of federal urban renewal turned out to be deeply problematic in New Haven and in most other American cities for reasons that I explore in the book. Most egregiously, the urban renewers here and elsewhere tore down a poor but still viable low-income neighborhood, the Oak Street area, to put up apartments that were aimed at keeping the middle class in the city. And they put in a highway to connect downtown to I-95. And they introduced a car-oriented suburban-like shopping center into downtown to try to beat their new competition at their own game. Here, you're seeing Logue with his deputy, Ralph Taylor, looking out of the window of the New Haven Redevelopment Authority at 19th century commercial buildings that they felt were far from being charming Victorian structures worthy of preservation. This was before Historic Preservation Acts protected what later were deemed valuable cultural assets, but also it's important to realize that building modern became an important symbolic statement in the eyes of urban renewers, a message that New Haven was moving into the future rather than being bogged down in its provincial past. And here, Mayor Lee, you see Mayor Lee proudly promoting his model for the new modern New Haven that he and Logue were envisioning. And close to him there, close are the University Tower apartment buildings. Lee and Logue also embraced modernism in their own private lives. For example, soon after they settled in New Haven, the Logues built a modern house, you see it here, unusual for the time and location, and it was inspired by the Japanese home that the Museum of Modern Art exhibited in its sculpture garden in 1953. The urban renewers learned, however, that leaving design decisions solely to those commissioning the buildings, who were often private corporations, often led to cheap, undistinguished modern architecture. Lee and Logue were humiliated, for instance, when the editor of Architectural Forum described the first structure to go up alongside the connector, you see it there, which was the call center headquarters for the Southern New England Telephone Company. And Architectural Forum described it as, and I quote, "that great green hulk of a building, which looks like it was designed by the janitor," end quote. Now, I should say that as a result of this experience, and when Logue got to Boston, he would appoint a design advisory committee headed by the chair of Harvard's design school at Harvard's architecture department. And on this committee also sat the deans of the architecture schools of Harvard and MIT. And architects were also brought in from outside Boston to critique individual projects. The important point here is that cities like New Haven were truly struggling in this post-war period. And Lee and Logue thought that they had to act, and they had to act quickly. Their salvation, they thought, lay with newly available federal funding from the Housing Acts of 1949 and 1954. And their ambitious goal was to make New Haven a national laboratory for physical renewal, as well as innovative social programs, many of which, like Head Start, neighborhood legal services, and job retraining, would later be incorporated into LBJ's Great Society. And in the end, New Haven got more dollars per capita from the federal government than any other city, and was widely viewed as ground zero for urban renewal. I also probed the way that New Haven's urban renewers consulted with community residents, and I discovered that although they felt that they were being democratically minded experts who were protecting the public good, their approach sought input mostly from representatives of established interest groups and community organizations. And in the book, I call this approach pluralist democracy, drawn from the analysis that the Yale political scientist Robert Dahl developed in his very famous case study of New Haven's urban renewal, which was entitled "Who Governs?" And that the important people who were left out of this process, of course, were those who were most affected by plans for urban renewal in their neighborhoods. So I conclude that phase one of urban renewal during the 1950s, with its massive clearance and pluralist democratic form of community consultation, was deeply flawed. In New Haven, as well as in many other cities, including Boston, where the destruction of the immigrant West End neighborhood followed much the same pattern as we see here in New Haven. So Act Two is Boston from 1960 to 1967. In 1960, Logue was hired. First, he was a consultant, and then he was approved to be head of a much expanded Boston Redevelopment Authority known as the BRA by another new mayor, this one, John Collins, who had ambitions to turn around his own near bankrupt and politically paralyzed city. And in Boston, Logue learned from his mistakes in New Haven and those that had taken place under the previous Boston mayor, John Hines. Logue came in waving a flag of planning with people, and he vowed never to undertake the kind of demolition that had happened in the West End neighborhood of Boston and in the Oak Street neighborhood of New Haven. I examined two dimensions of Logue's work in Boston: downtown and the neighborhoods. The heart of downtown urban renewal was the creation of Government Center to revitalize Boston's stagnant downtown, to greatly expand the number of jobs there, and to pressure a reluctant Yankee business elite to finally commit to the city that it had been ignoring for decades. Instead, they were investing their money anywhere else they thought they could make it. The Government Center story is a fascinating one, where Logue and Collins made full use of the federal purse and the federal power. As the Boston Globe wrote in 1962, in reviewing the just revealed and controversial City Hall design. And for those of you who don't know Government Center, City Hall is that low-rise building right there in the center. And this is what the Globe said, I quote, "Nothing but a wholehearted affirmation of a new time, new social needs, and the new technology and new aesthetics to declare faith in the civic instrument of government." Not a message we hear very often today, end quote. The architects of City Hall meant for it to be meant for its avant-garde, which so-called brutalist modernist design, to send exactly that message about the integrity of government. As Michael McKinnell, who was one of the architects of City Hall, put it many years later, he and his partners, and I quote McKinnell, had a tremendous feeling that government was not just a benevolent institution, but was the institution for social change. City Hall should be the people's palace, the symbol of open government, end quote. Likewise, they intended that large open plaza at the heart of Government Center to be the site of popular assembly, popular protest, only to discover later that it proved to be a hopelessly windswept and alienating space. The Government Center project marked another crucial evolution in Logue's thinking. Here, eventually, he came to recognize the importance of preserving some of Boston's historic structures, like the Sears Crescent, which you see there on the left, and Quincy Market on the right, to create a mix of historic and modern buildings, and that still characterizes Boston today. He also learned that he needed to broaden the base of support for his program, and hence he sought a range of influential allies, including the Catholic Church, and you can see here Cardinal Richard Cushing next to Mayor Collins, who had polio, which is why he's in a wheelchair, and Logue. Also, he found support from newspapers like the Boston Globe, retail store leaders like the presidents of Jordan Marsh and Filene's, local architects, and the integrationist-oriented Black middle class of Roxbury, who could own houses in very few Boston neighborhoods, and hence welcome Logue's attention to renewing their Washington Park neighborhood with open arms. And this comes, I think, as a surprise to many of us. Logue's efforts to revitalize Boston's other neighborhoods proved more contentious than either downtown or Washington Park. But in the end, Logue learned that just as it was necessary to negotiate between the promoters of modern and historic Boston, so too he had to negotiate with key neighborhood groups to achieve his renewal goals. And I look at 5 Boston neighborhoods. This, by the way, is Logue in waiting to testify to the city council in front of another huge model of the city. But the 5 Boston neighborhoods that he took on were Washington Park and Madison Park and Roxbury, Charlestown, the South End, and the North Harvard area of Allston. What I discovered is that every neighborhood had its own story. Attitudes that were based in class and race played an important role, but the outcome proved much more complicated, more varied, and more unexpected than the common assumption that urban renewal can always be reduced to the stereotypical story of middle-class whites invading the neighborhoods of low-income Blacks. Moreover, I argue that over the course of these years, through the urban renewal experience, neighborhood residents developed important skills of negotiating with city officials. Through what a participant observer, who was an MIT graduate student at the time and later became an MIT professor, Langley Keys, called the rehabilitation planning game. Ultimately, Boston citizens would apply these skills to gaining more affordable housing and defeating the Southwest Expressway and Interbelt Highway projects in the 1970s. Communities' experience of fighting urban renewal in the 1960s, I suggest, contributed to a new expectation for what a democratic process in city redevelopment must entail. As in other social movements like civil rights, anti-war politics, and feminism, grassroots participation became a requirement in cities. I call this participatory democracy, and it marked a big shift from the pluralist democratic expectations for community consultation of the 1950s. And what you're looking at here is a photo of popular protest in the North Harvard area of Allston, where there was a tremendous pushback against the BRA's plan, ultimately a successful one. Later in life, when Logue was getting ready to write that memoir that I mentioned to you, he listed his failure to negotiate with this community as the #1 greatest mistake of his career. And I should also note that similar grassroots protests against urban renewal took place in New Haven beginning in the mid to late 1960s. Logue was widely credited with bringing about the city's turnaround as the new Boston, but his Boston years ended with another surprise: his failed effort in 1967 to run for mayor of the city, when Collins announced that he was stepping down. It quickly became clear, however, that Logue was much better suited for the administrator's back room than the mayor's front office. He proved, I'm told by everyone, a terrible campaigner. But he also suffered from a 10-person race where the front runner was school segregationist Louise Day Hicks, and her popularity encouraged her opponents to rally around well-known Secretary of the Massachusetts Commonwealth, Kevin White. And you see here the headquarters of the Logue campaign that was closest to Washington Park, that middle-class Black neighborhood I mentioned earlier. And this, it should be noted, was the only precinct that Logue won outright. And it was clearly a repayment from the community for his support of urban renewal. Act 3, New York State, from 1968 to 1975. Logue's next act came when liberal Republican Governor Nelson Rockefeller was frustrated with his difficulty getting New York State voters to approve bond issues to construct what he considered to be crucial and much needed subsidized housing. So he came up with an ambitious workaround: a statewide urban renewal super agency with enormous powers, and he hired Ed Logue to head it. It was called the New York State Urban Development Corporation, known as the UDC for short. And it was funded by a combination of state appropriations, dwindling federal dollars, and in a unique move, bonds to be sold to private investors. And in recognition of the difficulty of doing this job, Rockefeller gave the UDC and Logue enormous authority, including the ability to acquire property through eminent domain, and most controversially, to override exclusionary local zoning and outdated building codes, which had long worked to keep out affordable housing, still does today. Given the UDC's power to challenge local zoning, it was very difficult to gain the state legislature's approval of the UDC, but it came about eventually, reluctantly, when Rockefeller argued after Martin Luther King was assassinated that New York needed, and I'm quoting Rockefeller here, a true memorial made not of stone, but of action, end quote. And it should also be said that Rockefeller was extremely good at twisting arms. The UDC had many successes. It built 33,000 units of housing over its 6.5 years. It sought alternatives to both suburban sprawl and demolition-style urban renewal by creating new towns on undeveloped land. 2 of them were in upstate New York, and one of them on what was then known as Welfare Island became known as Roosevelt Island in the East River of New York City. You see it there on the left. And it planned these new towns deliberately to be mixed income, mixed race, and mixed age communities. And it also experimented with innovative architectural designs and building technology, such as low density alternatives to what were the heavily criticized high-rise public housing. And you see there on the top right, there's a model of one of these projects, low-rise, high-density, called the Marcus Garvey Park Village in Brooklyn, which still exists today. The UDC put enormous emphasis on the quality of the architecture it built and the talent of the architects it hired. It was determined to remove the stigma and the cookie cutter approach that was often attached to subsidized housing. So Logue sought a large stable of high profile as well as up and coming architects. In fact, Philip Johnson, who had done the plan for Roosevelt Island, helped out by inviting Logue and his senior staff early on to a party in his glass house in New Canaan to introduce them to the young crowd of New York architects. But the UDC's successes did not last. All came tumbling down when Logue tried to build modest amounts of affordable housing in 9 well-off Westchester suburban communities, what he called a fair share housing program. And you're looking here at an image of a public protest meeting in Bedford And I think you can get the picture of how popular this plan actually turned out to be. The UDC was also deeply affected when President Nixon turned off the federal spigot and implemented a moratorium on all federal spending on housing as part of his new federalist agenda to reduce the role of the federal government. As a result, the UDC came to a dramatic collapse, including having bankers who had handled the bond sales accuse the UDC of putting its social mission before its responsibility to investors. In February 1975, the UDC disastrously defaulted on notes and loans, and Logue was forced to resign in great anger and frustration. As he put it, and I quote him, "It was too good to last, and that's why I so cordially dislike bankers. They felt threatened that I was engaged in," bankers actually said this, "social engineering, as if that's a mortal sin. I was very proud of the fact that Roosevelt Island was a total piece of social engineering," end quote. Final Act 4, South Bronx, from 1978 to 1985. And you see a much older Logue here from our earlier images. Logue became president of the South Bronx Development Organization, which was known as the SBDO. This was Logue's last major urban redevelopment job. And here Logue sought to rehabilitate himself after the UDC's spectacular failure, while he also aimed to rehabilitate one of the poorest areas in the nation. And he had less power, fewer tools, and a smaller amount of funding at his disposal than he had ever had before. Nixon's cuts in federal appropriations for cities and housing continued under President Carter, and then funding took an even bigger dive under President Reagan. Between 1981 and 1987, federal housing programs were slashed by 2/3, more than any other part of Reagan's budget. The federal government was going out of the business of supporting urban redevelopment, and in its place was actively promoting private market solutions. As president of the small, scrappy SBDO, Logue constantly scrambled for resources. And once again, he shifted strategy out of necessity, often seeking ways to take advantage of this new orientation to private market solutions. And he did that by developing industrial parks in the South Bronx and partnering with private lenders to build housing. Logue's signature program there was the surprising Charlotte Gardens, which were 90 ranch-style, prefabricated, single-family homes constructed in the middle of one of the most struggling neighborhoods in New York City. They were heavily subsidized for purchase with the goal of attracting lower middle-class homeowners to anchor the revitalization of the neighborhood. Multifamily rental housing was then expected to follow. To the surprise of many skeptics, Charlotte Gardens proved a huge success, with hundreds of Black and Puerto Rican Bronx residents, transit workers, security guards, firefighters and police officers, nurses and teachers, all eager to buy the kind of suburban style home that they couldn't afford or wasn't available to them as people of color in New York's mostly lily white suburban communities. A few aspects of the SBDO period I think are worth highlighting. First, here Logue clearly and regretfully abandoned his previous prioritizing of innovative architectural design. It became clear that that depended on public subsidy in favor of a conventional style that would appeal to the more traditional tastes of the local buyers as well as private funders. Second, Charlotte Gardens and other SBDO housing in the Bronx ultimately provided a blueprint for the more extensive 10-year Koch housing plan that followed, and that would add several 100,000 units of housing to the New York City housing stock. And third, most notably, after a long career of often playing lip service to that mantra of planning with people, here in the South Bronx, Logue actually did it, working closely with community planning boards and with neighborhood CDCs like the Mid-Bronx Desperados, and in that bottom picture, which I think we're blocking, you get a chance to see the woman, Genevieve Brooks, who really ran that CDC, the Mid-Bronx Desperados. And he came to realize through the SBDO experience in Charlotte Gardens how crucial working with local organizations were to achieving his success. In conclusion, let me just hit a few points that I think we can take away for today, for thinking about our urban problems that have persisted from this deep dive into Ed Logue's career. First, over time, Logue learned a lesson that many liberal do-gooders in other policy realms learned, that the work of the urban redevelopment expert, and this was a new profession that Logue himself had enthusiastically helped to create during the 1950s and 1960s, he learned that it had serious limitations. More grassroots participation by community members greatly mattered. In fact, were just crucial. Today, most cities have learned that they must engage neighborhoods in development decisions. Though I would point out that sometimes our challenge is quite the opposite, that we have to figure out how to avoid too much NIMBYism, not in my own backyard, or too narrow a focus on only one part of a city without considering the issues facing the city as a whole. Second, throughout Logue's career, he struggled to figure out how to create socially diverse communities by income, by race, and by age, which he felt was the best insurance that low and moderate income Americans, who are often minorities, would get decent and equitable services such as schools, transportation, and retail stores, as well as greater opportunities in the future. In a society where your residential address is often dictating your life chances, and middle-class whites are often positioned to demand the best, Logue promoted socially integrated communities. But he found himself frequently lacking the tools to do this. And I would argue that still today we struggle with, for example, how to keep existing residents in gentrifying neighborhoods, how to provide sufficient numbers of Section 8 vouchers for those low-income people who do want to move to better served communities, or how to bring to a larger scale the requirement that many cities has that developers of market rate housing must include affordable units or contribute to building it elsewhere. Third, another hard nut for Logue to crack was how to involve whole metropolitan areas in solving the housing, the schooling, and other problems facing cities and their low-income residents. Logue tried to do this rather fruitlessly in New Haven and in Boston. And when he got to New York, he hoped that finally his statewide authority at the UDC would help him make this happen in New York. But as you saw, in the end, that effort contributed to the downfall of both Logue and the UDC. And still today, I would suggest that metropolitan problem solving remains mostly elusive. Fourth and finally, probably the greatest disappointment and disillusionment in Logue's career was the decline in the role and responsibility of government, particularly at the federal level, for financing the revitalizing of cities and the subsidizing of affordable housing. Over his career, Logue watched federal support steadily shrink and responsibility shift to the private sector. But that a serious mistake, he thought, in his opinion. He anticipated what we too often encounter today, and you could think here about the Amazon headquarters sweepstakes, that cities are forced to make deals that in the end cost them in future tax revenues and undue burdens on public services, and races to the bottom between cities, where in the end they all lose out. And when it's not obvious how the private sector might profit, such as in building public infrastructure or civic spaces, too often those much needed projects go unaddressed and conditions simply deteriorate. Towards the end of his life, Logue said in sad resignation, and I quote him, "The basic responsibility for subsidizing housing for the low and lower income families is federal. It is everywhere in the developing world, used to be with us," end quote. Most importantly, even if we acknowledge that urban renewal was, at best, the proverbial mixed bag, I think we can still admire and seek to recapture the spirit of commitment and experimentation that propelled people like Logue, rather than content ourselves with accepting the limited palette of possibilities that has come to dominate since the 1980s. In the midst of our current multiple crises, that determination to make cities better for all, I think, is more needed now than ever. So I write at the close of my book, and I will just end by closing it, by quoting it. A better understanding of this history will hopefully reawaken from a long slumber the will and wherewithal to revitalize cities that still struggle for economic survival, to invest in neighborhoods still lacking adequate services, and to improve the prospects for those Americans still poorly housed or, in the worst cases, homeless. This would be the legacy of urban renewal that Ed Logue would want us to honor, and that he would consider the highest tribute we could pay to his lifetime of public service, imperfections, and all. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I will go ahead and jump in here, and we can start our Q&A session. Thank you to everybody who is already participating in that. And I'll get us started with, we had a good question here. What has been the most successful process for residents to participate in development efforts? And do you have any good examples?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure that we have really solved that. And there have been a lot of social scientists have actually tried to study that. I know a study, for example, where there was an assessment of who turns out at public meetings, and it might not surprise you to hear that they tend to be older, to be whiter, to be wealthier. So it's not clear that public meetings alone are the answer, because that is not necessarily, representing all the voices in a community. I think it is a real challenge. And I think that, city officials who really want to try to engage as much of the community as they can, I think have learned to have multiple sites for input. And to go to the people, not expect them to come to City Hall. So, going to community centers, having multiple kinds of events, going out into the community. But the reality is the people aren't all going to agree. And I think that the best, strategy is to have as many voices as possible at the table. And hope that the outcome there is a kind of negotiation between all of those interests. The biggest problem I think we have, though, in metropolitan areas is not really even within the city. It's between the city and its suburbs. So that if Greater Boston is an area, of course, I know well, and other than Boston and a few other towns and cities in the Greater Boston area, very few of the communities, despite a state mandate, are living up to their affordable housing mandate. It's just very difficult to get communities to accept it. And I think it's a complicated issue that has to do with the extent to which people are dependent on the value of their property and how they link that to many decisions about zoning and property values. But it's a real challenge. But I think it's important to recognize that that the process matters as much as the end product.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Having sat in on many a public meeting regarding preservation, it is the same people that come to those meetings.
Can I just say one other thing? And the questioner asked about models. One experiment that's happening now in a number of cities, it started first in Minneapolis, actually, is doing away with zoning, with single family zoning, and just say, making it possible, whether it will actually happen is another story, for a multi-unit building to be next door to a single family house, and for there to be density then around transit, but to really open things up for more possibilities.
I agree. That's great. So another question we have here is, and this maybe is a good follow-up to our first question, but how do we better integrate public housing and its residents into the neighborhoods once it's there? Because there's often such a divide within neighborhoods and residents when they've been placed there, so to speak, for the purposes of public housing.
Yeah, I mean, these are the tough challenges we face as
Yeah.
a society. I do think that I did kind of allude to this towards the end. Some of the strategies that I think would help to build more socially integrated, and it's income as well as race and age. I mean, there are many things that are segregated in our society. I think some of the strategies I alluded to, so that, for example, if we were subsidizing housing of low-income people in communities that were being gentrified so that they did not need to leave as those neighborhoods kind of became more upscale, that would be one way. The Section 8 vouchers were intended as a strategy to give low-income people the option to live in higher income neighborhoods where schools were going to be better and services would be better. The problem is in the way that they have been implemented. So one problem is the demand is much, much higher than the supply. There are long waiting lists for Section 8 vouchers in most cities. So that's one thing. Another issue, though, has been that landlords have been able to turn down people who want to use Section 8 vouchers. So what happens in many cities is that people with Section 8 vouchers end up in the same low-income neighborhoods, maybe slightly out further, neighborhoods that may have been sort of more middle class and now are sort of not so much anymore. But we resegregate with a tool that was intended to integrate, and it's that is really a failure. I think we need more money put into Section 8 vouchers, and we also have to not make it so easy for landlords to turn it down. And then the third reason they haven't worked as well as they should, there are two other things I would point to. One is, there's been an experiment with this. Often the rent allowed with them is not high enough for the neighborhoods that people want to move to. And the last is that it can be very intimidating and confusing for a person who lived in an inner city neighborhood to figure out how to access something that an apartment in a neighborhood, in a community that might in fact be desirable. And so there's been an experiment, I think in Seattle, where an advisor has been assigned to a Section 8 voucher holder to work with them to try to find better options. And that has been working actually quite well. Now, it's difficult to scale that up. This has been a much more controlled experiment, but I think we can learn from all of this. And there are a lot of people in the housing field who are very concerned about these issues and I think are probably hopeful right now in the Biden administration that they're going to see some of these things come to be.
I agree that. Thank you. So could you talk a little bit more about why New Haven was chosen to receive so much federal funding? What were some of the factors that went into that decision?
Well, I did talk about this in the book, and there's a number of reasons I think that why it happened. One of when the act passed, the money was sitting there, and not many cities were in a position to apply for it. You had to have a plan, and you had to have a redevelopment authority already in existence. And most cities just started to create those redevelopment authorities. New Haven already had a plan, and it's on the cover of the Connecticut Explored. Tomorrow is Here magazine that I have the little piece in. So a man named Maurice Rodeval, who was really an international planner of European birth, but he had a practice in New Haven, and he taught at Yale. He taught in the architecture school, and he also taught law students, and Logue actually had him as a teacher. He had first developed a plan in 1941, that Tomorrow Is Here plan. And so he had updated it at several points along the way. So when Logue and Lee got into the saddle after Lee was elected in 1953, they had a plan to call on. They had a redevelopment authority already in existence, and they were quite aggressive, and they went down to Washington. I have a wonderful quote from someone who, Alan Talbot, who worked for the New Haven Redevelopment Authority, who said, they showed up in Washington with their plans rolled up and were ready to go. And so that was a major piece. It also, I think, so they were ready to go. They were they thought they knew what they were doing. And also, I think the scale of New Haven made it seem to what Logue called the feds, as a project that could be successful. Lee was very well thought of in Washington, and he as kind of a Kennedy-esque sort of figure in time, and he was actually did identify very strongly with JFK. They just managed, they had their act together, they kept going for more grants with proposals, and they got it. Now, they didn't get as much money in total, it was per capita, and but it was a lot more per capita than the next highest, which was Newark.
Great. Yeah, it seems like New Haven was just poised to be the right city at the right time. So New Haven, as I'm sure a lot of our viewers are aware, has become really good at recognizing the importance of its modern architecture and the need to preserve it. But to what extent is this happening in other cities that have a lot of really significant modern architecture? And then my own sort of follow-up to that question is, how do other cities recognize the role that those buildings might have played in urban renewal while still recognizing the need to preserve them now?
Very good question. Look, first, I just want to say that the Logue's house is on the list of modern architecture, and people can even access the form and the photographs if you want to see, the back of the house. And I was very excited that photograph I showed you was one I took, but I was very happy to see that. Well, I think, you've hit on a very challenging issue. And there is an organization, a national organization called DACAMOMO, which I'm sure you know about, yeah. But not everybody may, which is devoted to the preservation and appreciation of modern architecture. There are many people who think it's ironic, of course, because they are angry at what was torn down from the past, but now they also want to tear down the modern architecture that was built in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And, I think that we have a responsibility to preserve that architecture as well, because it is a statement about the times. And, it's challenging, and some of it has not been maintained properly. And this is a big problem with modernist architecture. You know it, but everyone may not, in that concrete was used a lot, and it didn't always work terribly well in northern climates. And it would do better if it had been maintained. But soon after a lot of it was built, many cities went into pretty tough times. Starting basically in the 1970s, budgets were cut, maintenance was eliminated, and so there are many modern buildings that haven't worn well. But we have learned that if when properly restored, we can bring them back to life. It doesn't mean, and I think this is true for any architecture, that you save everything. You want to save architecture that is, of course, significant. That is important, aesthetically and architecturally, but also architecture that is associated with important sort of parts of our history. And this can be hard for some people to accept, when it's buildings that they really don't like. I can't tell you how many people hate the Boston City Hall. This has been a huge debate in Boston. The previous mayor, Mayor Menino, was determined to tear it down or sell it and move the city hall to the new seaport area, which he was developing. The irony of that, of course, was that the city hall that is still there, what had been built as an effort to revitalize downtown, which was pretty dead and underinvested in. And so here he was actually doing the very same thing, trying to jumpstart his own new seaport neighborhood. But that didn't happen. And the city hall has many defenders, including some young architects in the city who see it as a very important building. And in fact, architects have voted it to be one of the most important buildings in the 20th century, which most Boston residents would not believe. But that building is important architecturally and historically, and should definitely survive. We're actually having a fight right now, though I think that the governor has backed off on a Paul Rudolph design. It's called the State Service Center. It's on the fringes of Government Center. Very interesting building that also was let to run down. And the governor wanted to get rid of it, either sell it off or whatever. But there was a big pushback because I think people are starting to recognize that this modern architecture is significant. Paul Rudolph buildings, though, have been torn down all over. It's not a necessary ticket that he designed it. The Yale architecture dean and person who built the Temple Street garage in downtown New Haven. He and Logue were very close. They were in communication through most of their lives, and met in New Haven. And Rudolph was a kind of advisor on the downtown plan.
Well, I for one am glad the Boston City Hall is still around, because it's something else.
You would, but it's good. But your preservation, do you feel? Can I ask you? I mean,
Yeah.
Are these discussions and debates that happen within New Haven?
Absolutely, and you can see it with something like the Pirelli building that's so prominent for its location, and also just for for what's going on with it right now. But I think in a lot of cases, there's a knee-jerk reaction to hate these buildings because of maybe what they replaced. But my approach is always to, stand where we are now, and can we stand to lose something there again? That's.
I want to just mention something though that I think is relevant, which is that there are many people sort of scorn brutalist buildings and modernist, mostly public buildings, I think, today. But that should give you some indication and insight into the way that people in the 50s, like Lee and Logue, viewed the Victorian buildings that they saw downtown, that they saw them as a symbol of all that was wrong with New Haven, how the city hadn't changed since the 19th century, that if they were going to ever get, interest and investment in this city, they had to make some bold statements. So, it's a similar kind of dynamic.
Yeah, it is. And but it's such an interesting dynamic, and I'm glad we have these buildings and these discussions here. I did want to mention on a separate note, I'm aware that my logo is backwards. I've switched it back and forth, and it's not moving. So that is NHPT and not some strange Russian. But I've got a question here about transportation, and I think that's something that is vital to successful cities, public transportation. So in your research, how did tensions between the public transport lobby and the automobile lobby play out, and how can we learn from that today?
Well, I think it's not even a contest. I think the automobile lobby always wins in this country. If anybody's been to France, to Sweden, to Hong Kong, to Korea, to Japan, anywhere else in the world where there has been a lot of state investment in public transportation, you experience a very different kind of train and metro system than what we have here. And something I just read today discouraged me a lot, which is a prediction that with so many people not riding public transit in many cities with COVID, and perhaps not going back to the same kind of commuting patterns they once had, that we are going to see a decline in ridership. And we know that is going to be a factor. And given the way we do expect, I think, too much public transit to pay for itself in this country. So, what happens is fares just go up, and the frequency gets cut, and then it becomes less reliable as a mode of transit. It's a vicious cycle. So you all know that. I think we have a serious problem, and I hope that we will start to invest in mass transit. We see with the climate issues, the cost we're paying for all of this sort of dependence on cars. And to be honest, a lot of this, the danger, the destructive things that happened in the urban renewal period with these highways that were slashed through neighborhoods were about trying to figure out how to keep a city like a downtown like New Haven's viable when the major highway was going to bypass the city. They knew it was not a good solution. Traffic that was going long distance used to come through New Haven, and it created all kinds of traffic and pollution, and it was just a complete mess. So they understood that there needed to be a bypass. On the other hand, they saw that as I said, a death knell for the city's retail district. So we've always been in this tension. New Haven had also had streetcars, which New Haven was one of the last Connecticut cities to take down, not all that long before all this story that I'm telling. So I think we have to figure out, but it's such a vicious cycle, because if it doesn't go to enough places, people, even if they want to, can't use it. And so many of the mass transits that have been put in recent years. So for example, LA, as many people may know, has in recent years put in a kind of metro system. But it's basically rooted to get people who live like in Santa Monica to downtown LA to work. And that's been true. That's an accusation that's been made, for example, of the Washington Metro, that it was designed to get suburban Maryland and Virginia residents to downtown DC, and not to help people who live in DC move around the city. So it's a question of design and of incentives. It has to be subsidized enough so that it's good enough that people see it as a convenient option. But we have to really change our mindset in this country, I think. And they go together. If it gets better, I think there's more opportunity for people to change their mindset.
I agree. And it's, I think it's another thing that public transportation is so rooted in certain cities. For example, you can't think of New York without thinking about the subway, or I can't. And personally, I love it. I love it for all of its grungy griminess and everything. But I'm from Nashville, and there's some talk of, no public transportation there. And there's some talk of trying to get a public transportation system going, and people just kind of laugh at it because it's not in the mentality of people who live there. And that's another big part of it.
So I would point out that, Sunbelt cities have, I mentioned LA, Phoenix, and Houston have in recent years put in mass transit, but again, it's not, a full system. That's basically to get people downtown, because, you go to some cities in the United States, many cities, and all people can talk about is the traffic. And, a few years ago, I went to Seattle, and people were saying where there's just that one highway sort of through the city, saying it doesn't matter what time of the day or what time of the night, or LA, it's just always bad. So, we really do have some serious problems in this country and I think that they can't be solved on the local level, and they probably can't be solved on the state level. Because remember that only the federal government can run a debt. State and local governments have to balance their books, their budgets. And it's just not easy to think about how to do this, to huge investments.
Yeah. So I have I think what would make a good follow-up question to that, and maybe our final question. You started touching on sort of post-COVID public transportation, but what are you seeing as far as what's going to happen to our quote star cities post-COVID? With people leaving, is it going to be just another example of sort of the mass exodus of cities, and then in a decade there's going to be incentive to return to cities, and it's just going to ebb and flow?
One good thing about being an historian is you have to predict the future. We study the past.
Exactly.
But there's an awful lot of ink being spilled on this issue. Mm-hmm. So I just saw an article today that I thought was extremely interesting, which was arguing that, and this is actually a column, an opinion column in the New York Times, I think, that this could end up to be good for small scale cities. So that when people are leaving LA and New York, they're not particularly on a larger scale than just, going to the suburbs. They're going to other cities, to smaller cities, where housing is cheaper, where lifestyle may be easier. They may be working more remotely, so it's possible. So we know, for example, that Silicon Valley is moving a lot to Austin, Texas. And there are a lot of those kind of small scale cities that have Nashville, where you're from, is become a very attractive city, and they're actually getting a lot of not just music, and they're getting a lot of investment in companies coming. So it could end up to be that there'll be. I don't think people are going to leave cities. It's a question of, are they going to leave these very big cities that are so expensive? What I would hope for would be that this might help to address the have and have nots that I mentioned in my talk, because we have cities that have been doing very well: Boston, San Francisco. What else should I point to? I mean, Nashville, I think, has done well. Atlanta, New York, Washington, and then we have the cities that have been doing very badly: Baltimore, Newark, Detroit, Cleveland. You can just everybody knows these cities. And that's been unfortunate. But, and so maybe there'll be some positive side to this, and that people, I'm not sure that but though a city like Newark is apparently getting more people coming. I have a daughter who lives in Jersey City. Jersey City is booming right now, with people who see it as a more affordable place to live, very convenient to New York. Now, that does raise other questions, gentrification issue, for example. And that's why we have to have protections so that they stay diverse cities. But, I think that there's some other issues to consider here too, which is, even in the cities where people remain, will they still be working downtown? What's going to happen to downtown business districts, which, were profitable not just in terms of the rents of offices, but think of all of the auxiliary, businesses, the restaurants, the stores, all of the other things that really lived off of all of that density of workers. And it's pretty devastating if people don't go back to downtown.
It is, and I think working from home is just part of that as well.
I couldn't hear that.
Working from home is playing into that as well. As I
that's what I mean.
Office.
They're not going. And businesses are. I actually had a team of undergraduates in a course I taught this fall, which was about. The course was about the sort of American built environment, and cities in the post-war period. And I had these teams looking at different issues that cities are, that greater metropolitan areas are facing today. We looked at retail, at downtown offices, and so forth. And the downtown office team really came up with a lot of interesting evidence that many corporations are really calculating that they can save a lot of money if their workers stay remote, say, several days of the week. And they won't need as many offices, but down in their main headquarters, they would just perhaps need conference rooms and shared office space. Could save a lot of money that way. And they've learned that workers are productive when they work at home.
Yeah. Well, we are approaching 7:30, so I'm going to wrap up our Q&A. Thank you, Elizabeth. I really enjoyed this last 30 minutes chatting, and I'm going to pass it back over to Margaret Ann.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
So, thank you, Dr. Cohen, for your work, for being with us tonight. Thank you, Elizabeth, and the Preservation Trust, New Haven Preservation Trust, and thank you, Connecticut Explored Magazine, Elizabeth Norman. And thank you all for being with us. So we look forward to seeing you again, and please come visit the museum. Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.